of Major General retired Arnold L. Punaro, the chairman of the Reserve Forces Policy Board. He is escorted by Major General retired Gus Hargett, the president of the National Guard Association of the United States.
Will the Sergeant at Arms please escort our distinguished guest and General Hargett to the podium? Our first speaker this morning is one of the most persuasive advocates for the National Guard and the Reserve in Washington. And his credibility on the subject is more than just a product of his way with words, although he's pretty good with it. This man knows the National Guard and Reserve through personal experience, and he's been a great voice for all of us out there. He knows the Guard and Reserve's cost effectiveness because he's objectively run the numbers. Ladies and gentlemen, General Punaro.
Thank you.
They love you.
Yeah. Well, thank you, General Assenhurst. Thank you for that warm welcome. I appreciate it. Well, I'm honored to speak at another NGAUS convention. This is a battle-tested organization supporting one of our nation's oldest and most important institutions, America's National Guard. The role of the Guard is enshrined in our Constitution, and just as the Minutemen of the Revolution were essential to yesterday's victories, today's Guard is just as essential. We're reminded of that as members of the National Guard still stand watch in New York's Penn Station on the 15th anniversary of 9/11. And just as important, though, we should recognize that whatever any of us here today accomplish as individuals, we stand on the shoulders of those who went before us. The great Guard and NGAUS leaders in the audience today and their predecessors, and I see the lineup there sitting right in the front. Thank you all for your leadership. And a special shout out to my good friend Major General Gus Hargett, completing a highly successful tour leading NGAUS. Gus, we salute you. Now, were any of you at the Hawaii Convention in 1991, 25 years ago? A couple of you in the front were. Well, the assessment I will provide of today's circumstances is a far cry from the one I gave this same convention in Hawaii 25 years ago, 1991. At that time, the Pentagon leadership was recommending drastic cuts in the Guard and Reserve, ignoring the major contribution they made in Desert Shield, Desert Storm. Despite the mobilization of over 228,000 Guardsmen and Reservists to support combat operations in the first Gulf War, NGAUS went into action. Congress blocked the Pentagon, making the case that the Guard and Reserve would be essential to the threats our nation would face in the future. A little more than a decade later, the Guard and Reserve would at one point constitute over 45% of the forces on the ground in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we've had over 930,000 members of the Guard and Reserve deployed since 9/11 overseas while supporting hundreds of events at home. Now here's the key. Not only have the Guard and Reserve deployed into harm's way, they have performed at the same level of excellence as the active forces. Because some recently retired military leaders had questioned that performance, as chairman of the Reserve Forces Policy Board, I asked one of the nation's premier analytical think tanks, the Institute for Defense Analysis, to do an objective and analytical study of the Guard and Reserve's operational effectiveness in wartime as compared to the active forces. IDA looked at all the available data, the Defense Manpower Data Center, safety mishap data, combat studies, Institute archived interviews, after-action reports, theater history of operations reports, mobility databases, and the significant activity data. In addition, IDA interviewed over 50 of the most senior military leaders who were active duty commanders and had Guard and Reserve forces assigned to them. IDA then developed a coding methodology to translate this into measurable and comparative data with hundreds of thousands of data points. Well, we could spend hours on this subject, but let me give you the results. There was no, I repeat, no measurable difference in the performance of the active Guard and Reserve forces. And the active component leaders at both the strategic and operational level were pleased with the overall contributions and performance of the reserve components. This is the first time this kind of study has ever been done. We no longer have to deal with stray voltage from some who said the Guard really didn't do that well, or their assignments were easier. The data is convincing and compelling and proves the naysayers flat wrong. And again, the complete study will be available shortly to anyone and everyone. We'll publish it on our RIPB website, and it's available publicly. So thank goodness, with NGAUS in the lead, we rejected the plans by the Pentagon in 1991 to put the Guard and Reserve on the shelf. Without the availability of the Guard and Reserve since 9/11, we would not have been able to conduct operations in Iraq and Afghanistan at the required levels or to deal with challenging man-made and natural disasters at home. And you know, I'm always amused when I hear from time to time the suggestion by some that the active Army can substitute for the Guard as first responders at home. When I hear that, I respond by saying, you know, it's a miracle how fast the soldiers from the 82nd Airborne got from Fort Bragg to the bomb blast at the Boston Marathon. Oh, wait a minute. Those weren't soldiers in uniform for the 82nd Airborne that were at the point of attack in 10 seconds. That was the Massachusetts National Guard. Oh. And I can tell you, though, today's Pentagon leadership is far different from those in charge in September 1991. Secretary of Defense Ash Carter is a true believer and strong supporter of the total force approach to the all-volunteer force. Just ask the governors who were on the recent call with him on the Army Commission results. And at the Office of the Secretary of Defense, we enjoy similar support from the Deputy Bob Work, the Acting Undersecretary for Personnel and Readiness, Peter Levine, and the Assistant Secretary for Manpower and Reserve Affairs, Todd Weiler, and his team. I can tell you we could not have a more positive circumstance as we transition to a new administration in January 2017. Well, you might be thinking to yourself, has he forgotten the fact that we had to have an Air Force Commission and then an Army Commission to solve disagreements between the military departments and their reserve and Guard components? No, but the results of both those commissions, without NGAUS we wouldn't have had them, have been endorsed by OSD and the military department leadership, thanks to the great work of General Grass, General Lingell, and our Army and Air Force directors working with OSD and the military department leadership. Everyone is moving out smartly in terms of their full implementation. And I know that when General Mark Milley spoke to this group last year, pretty soon after being sworn in as Chief of Staff of the Army, his words were a marked departure from those of his predecessor. As you heard from him just a day or two ago, General Milley is firm in his belief that there is one Army, 18 divisions, 60 brigades, and 980,000 plus soldiers. With Eric Fanning as Secretary of the Army and Patrick Murphy as the Undersecretary, we have two powerful civilian champions as well. Secretary Fanning has joined General Milley in involving tags and decisions, and in making the decision that the future Army will have at least 54% of its end strength in the Guard and Reserve. Secretary Fanning was also the Undersecretary of the Air Force, where the Air Force Commission provided their recommendations, and he championed them with General Mark Welch and Secretary Debbie James, who you also heard from. Secretary James had a previous commendable tour as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Reserve Affairs, and with General Mark Welch, they provided a strong foundation for General Dave Goldfein, who you heard from yesterday, who has picked up right where General Welch left off. In fact, the Air Force has now been so successful with total force integration that a recent paper from the Objective Congressional Budget Office on Military Force Structure noted, and I quote, "More than the other services, the Air Force integrates the personnel from its active and reserve components very tightly. In many cases, it is misleading to treat the Air Force as composed of separate active and reserve components," end quote. What a tribute to our Air Guardsmen and Air Force reservists. And the Guard relationship with Northern Command has become a true partnership. Lieutenant General Steve Blum established the first beachhead out there when the welcome mat was not fully out. And General Frank Grass, as the deputy, with a succession of thoughtful commanders, has created what is now a model for civil support. The newest commander, General Lori Robinson, has already proven she is making it even better. Some of you may have seen the change of responsibility with General Lingell and General Grass in August. I was present for that really inspiring event. I was struck by the comments of our Secretary of Defense, Ash Carter. The Secretary said, quote, "Today's Guard is battle-tested, an agile, flexible, deployable force with combat experience and a broad range of skills gained both on the battlefield and in civilian life. The National Guard is a critical component of our total force, bringing to bear the experience and skills of our citizen warriors wherever and whenever needed to confront the challenges of a complex world," end quote. This is a powerful statement from the civilian leader of the world's largest and most complex organization. But Carter went on to say, quote, "The more deeply integrated the Guard becomes in all facets of planning and execution, the better prepared the nation becomes. The presence, skill, and readiness of citizen warriors across the country gives us the agility and flexibility to handle unexpected demands both at home and abroad. It is an essential component of the total force and a linchpin of our readiness," end quote. Let me repeat that, the linchpin of our readiness. I must say, not is all sweetness and light. Ensuring that day-to-day readiness, the linchpin, is the challenge we face. That operational readiness is at the mercy of one of the worst public policy decisions I have seen in my 40-plus years in the national security field, the mindless sequester, which is disconnected from the growing threats we face at home and the simultaneous requirements to modernize our forces while maintaining our warfighting readiness to respond quickly. And the sequester has not cut one nickel from the parts of the federal budget that are growing like the kudzu in Mississippi, the entitlements, which account for $3 trillion in annual spending and will grow by $9 trillion in the next 10 years. The leadership of the defense committees, with Senator Lindsey Graham carrying the battle flag, have joined the Pentagon in fighting the sequester. When a new administration and Congress are sworn in 2017, they should immediately work on a grand compromise that addresses all elements of spending, revenues, and entitlements. We need to ensure that DoD's resources are sufficient and stable to deal with the current chaotic strategic environment and are not driven by the sequester, an approach to budget control that has few merits and even fewer advocates. While the sequester remains the law for fiscal 18 and beyond, it should be given a quiet burial as soon as possible. Let me close by giving you a quick update on some of the ongoing work of the Reserve Forces Policy Board that I've been privileged to chair for 3 Secretaries of Defense, Panetta, Hagel, and Carter. We report directly to the Secretary of Defense and our terrific executive directors, Major General Walt Lard, Army National Guard, and leads our superb staff of experts from all the reserve components. Walt is here today with his wife, Grace, and his son, Second Lieutenant Drew Lard, along with my son, First Lieutenant Dan Punaro, a platoon leader in the Delaware National Guard, with its legendary tag, General Frank Babla. Since 2012, the board has produced 16 reports with 54 recommendations to the Secretary of Defense, ensuring a ready, capable, and available and sustainable Operation Guard and Reserve, creating a continuum of service, enhancing DoD's role in the homeland, and many more. We're currently preparing a publication for the upcoming transition to the new administration to educate incoming leaders on both the reserve components in general and in particular the importance of maintaining the National Guard as an operational force and what that entails in terms of changing outdated policies and providing needed budgets. We're emphasizing the need for funding to be included in the annual budgets to maintain the Guard's operational readiness and their inclusion in today's Army and Air Force rotational deployments. One idea that has been brought to our attention, Gus and I have talked about this over the years, is creating a special account for operational funding, just like we have for equipment in the National Guard and Reserve Equipment account. It's important as the leadership, the new leadership that comes in January, addresses future force structure, they recognize the true bargain of the Guard and Reserve and the need to balance any active increases with commensurate adjustments in the Guard and Reserve. So I will tell you, we could not be in a stronger position to make this case, given the stellar results of the Guard at home and abroad and the support of our senior military leaders who will remain as the civilian leadership changes. And that is due to each and every one of you that serve in the Guard, whether you're a soldier, an airman, a civilian, a defense industry contractor. We couldn't thank you enough for putting us in this very enviable position with the severe challenges our nation faces at home and abroad. Thank you very much.
General Punaro, thank you for addressing us today, and thank you for being the friend that you have been for so long to us. Please accept this little memento as a memento of this occasion. It's a book titled What So Proudly We Hailed. It's the first biography of Francis Scott Key in 75 years, and as you know, he penned the words that would become the lyrics of our national anthem right here in Baltimore over 200 years ago. Sir, thank you so much for what you do.
Appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Would the Sergeant at Arms please escort our distinguished guest and his party from the podium?